Okay, and just to remind everybody, the full bios of all of our panelists, our moderators, are in your program. They're in the packages, they're online, they're available through the mobile app. So I'll be very short in introducing Ambassador Dave Balton, especially since he was introduced earlier on the Cuba session. Only to say that Dave serves multiple roles at State Department, chair of the Senior Arctic Officials, but his day job is as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans and Fisheries in the Bureau of OES at State Department, a longtime colleague of mine, going back 20 some odd years, Dave Balton.
Thanks very much, Jason. Good afternoon to all of you, both in the room and those of you who are watching online. The Arctic Ocean is a new ocean, we have heard already today. Certainly the Arctic region is attracting attention as never before, both here at home and around the world. There are opportunities in the changing Arctic, but there are also real challenges that the Arctic Ocean is facing. And here to talk about all this with me and with you today are a distinguished panel. And I will say that if at some point in the course of the discussion Senator Murkowski makes it here, we will take a break and allow her to say a few words as well, and then I assume hustle back to vote. Let me introduce our panelists, all close friends of mine. To my immediate left is Lawson Brigham. He is the Distinguished Professor of Geography and Arctic Policy at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He had, before that, a long career in the U.S. Coast Guard, and among other things was captain of the Polar Sea, a U.S. icebreaker, a rare U.S. icebreaker. In the Arctic Council, he's been wearing a number of hats, and perhaps his greatest contribution among many in the Arctic Council context was as one of the prime movers and shakers behind the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment. To his left is Lisa Spear with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Lisa directs their International Ocean Program. She has also been a big player on Arctic issues, including in the Arctic Council. She's focusing primarily on protecting marine biodiversity, particularly in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And to her left is my new colleague, not so new I guess at this point, Admiral Robert Patt, who completed a long and distinguished career at the U.S. Coast Guard as well, capped by being commandant in his last years there. He then came over to my building, to the Department of State, where he is carrying the title of Special Representative for the Arctic. And one of his major roles in that capacity is to coordinate and oversee the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, which began just a few weeks ago and will extend into the spring of 2017. I will begin the panel with a few open-ended questions, but I really am hoping this will be an interactive dialogue with those of you, again, in the room, and those of you watching online. For those of you in the room, there will be people around carrying cards. I encourage you all to fill in questions. They will be passed to me. I will sort through them and pose them to our panelists. Also, for those of you watching online, you have the ability to send in comments and questions, and they will also wend their way to me. So, without further ado, Admiral Papp, the Arctic Council ministers met just a few weeks ago in Iqaluit, Canada, and they adopted a program for the coming 2 years that was proposed essentially by the United States in collaboration with the other members of the Council. A major focus of the U.S. proposed program, now the Arctic Council program, relates to issues of the Arctic Ocean, the Arctic marine space. Can you tell us a little bit more about those initiatives and what you would like to see the Arctic Council working on with respect to oceans over the next 2 years?
Thanks, Dave. I'd be glad to. And first of all, good afternoon to everybody. This is really a great-sized crowd here, really diverse. In the year I've been with the State Department, I've had a chance to talk to many groups across the country and internationally, and I see so many friendly faces, people that I've met in my travels. It's good to see you all here today. And Dave, I'm loath to talk solely about ocean issues for the Arctic Council because somebody, and I can't remember who he is, when I came to the State Department, When I proposed all the things that I thought was important for the Arctic Council chairmanship program, he said, well, that sounds like you're a former commandant of the Coast Guard. I don't know who that was.
It might have been me.
And I stand guilty. And of course, I think oceans is, of course, the appropriate issue to talk about here. But I also want to say that one of the things that we strived for in the State Department was to come up with a balanced program. The two words that are repeated most often when I talk to the other countries within the Arctic Council and other countries that are interested, as they say, wow, you have a rather ambitious program. And what I found is whether we're talking to NGOs, whether they're environmentally focused or marine shipping or security oriented, whatever it is, everybody seems to see something for themselves in this program. So yes, we're looking at Arctic ocean safety, security, and stewardship, but we're also looking at improving living and economic conditions for the communities of the Arctic. And then another third of our program is looking at how do we adapt to climate change. Very important issue for us. But of course, the focus is oceans here, and I'm glad to talk about that. And it's really, I would have to admit privately, the part that I get most excited about, because I see so much that needs to be done. And it sort of fits within a philosophy that I have espoused for a long time. And that's, if you're a maritime nation, the greatness of that maritime nation is measured by the amount of resources that that nation devotes to the safety and security of mariners who will approach and depart its shores. It's a fundamental notion that this country has accepted for a very long time. You can see it in the writings of Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, talking about how our country, in order to be prosperous and to have peace and tranquility, would have to be involved in maritime trade. And one of the first acts of our first Congress was to consolidate the lighthouses for this country in order to provide the safe approaches for mariners to our shores. And I've gone back through history, and great countries, great maritime nations throughout centuries and centuries have focused on how do you bring people safely to your shores in order to have prosperity. And I won't take you through my history lesson, which I do if I've got much more time, but suffice to say, it's very important. And then as we look to the Arctic, I was reminded when we were in Iqaluit that Iqaluit sits on Frobisher Bay. Sir Martin Frobisher, tried to find the Northwest Passage 3 times in the late 1500s. 200 years before Captain James Cook tried to find it, going through the Bering Strait and going in an easterly direction. So countries have been looking for more economical sea routes to be able to carry out the commerce of the world for many, many years. It's really why we're here today. If the Arctic Ocean was not opening up, we would not be here, I don't think. I mean, the Arctic Council, for probably its first decade, focused on environmental concerns and looking at sustainable development. But things really started picking up as the ice began receding and the potential for new sea routes have developed, and there's an awful lot of interest. That's why you see China. That's why you see Singapore so interested in the Arctic, because it's going to change the maritime dynamics of this world. So, as human activity picks up, it's very important for us to be prepared for it, both as a nation and also as the nations of the Arctic Council. So fully a third of our program is focused on Arctic ocean safety, security, and stewardship. Within that, I think 2 of the most significant accomplishments of the Arctic Council to date was the Search and Rescue Agreement and the Marine Oil Spill Preparedness and Response Agreement. But agreements are good on paper until you start exercising them and testing them. You don't know if you've got the proper resources and policies and whatever else in place. So over the course of our chairmanship, we look to lead exercises, particularly in search and rescue, to see how well prepared we are for this. Besides search and rescue and environmental protection, we're also looking at the potential for a regional seas program. Regional seas programs have been employed around the world. I think a good start is coming to an agreement on how we use those search and rescue resources, how we share ice-breaking resources, other things. Come to an agreement between the countries on how we deal with this area. We want to connect the established marine protected areas and perhaps look at other areas that need protection as well. And then, of course, there's a lot of work to be done on ocean acidification. So fully 5 good projects within the ocean safety, security, and stewardship option, and that's it.
Thanks very much, Admiral. So Lawson, the Admiral spoke about Arctic shipping. You helped to bring to fruition the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, which called attention to the fact that Arctic shipping is already increasing and has the potential to increase further. While the Arctic Council has been looking at this, the International Maritime Organization has been working on and has now adopted so-called Polar Code, Polar Shipping Code. Lawson, in your view, are there things that the Arctic Council, its members and observers, can be doing now to help ensure safe, reliable, secure Arctic shipping into the future?
Thanks, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. The Arctic Council has been dealing with the issue of protecting the Arctic Ocean before the Arctic Council. In the Rovaniemi process, Finland had in its program of pushing internationalizing the Arctic Ocean and addressing the issues. The protection of the Arctic marine environment was a key component, and that working group exists today and is really providing the framework, the consensus-driven reports that the Arctic Council sends out to the world on how they're going to protect people and the place. One, Arctic Marine Strategic Plan, as Dave mentioned, still being implemented are recommendations of the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment. You might think 2009 that's really a long time ago. But since then, in each of the ministerials, including our ministerial in 2017, there have been an implementation plan, a status report. And the PAME, www.pame.is for Iceland, where the Secretariat is, you should really look at the website. It has world-class reports. And a lot of people don't know that actually the Arctic Council has been, in PAME, has been a leader in the protection efforts. And in fact, it's the 8 Arctic states who, in their delegations at IMO, have pushed very, very hard for a mandatory polar code. And this polar code, as you probably all know, will come into force on the 1st of January 2017. It's kind of a holistic look at protecting people, the place and people from shipping, commercial shipping and passenger vessels, all over 500 tons or more. And most of the vessels we're talking about are all over 500 tons. It has a whole host of amendments to MARPOL, the Maritime Pollution Convention. SOLAS is the Safety of Life at Sea Convention. And all of these have been argued by the Arctic states at IMO, at their delegations. So I think some of us look to, in the United States leadership, to push also the Polar Code during its chairmanship, along with the 8 other Arctic states, as a seminal and historic new regime. New regimes don't come around very often in many places of the world, but here's one for the Arctic Ocean in January 2017. So I would say that the Arctic Council has been the preeminent and proactive forum of any organization on the planet in protecting, in devising strategies to protect the environment, but perhaps even more, the coastal communities.
Thanks very much, Lawson. I think we now have with us Senator Murkowski, and I think we'll take a break from the Q&A. Turn this back over to Jason for the minute.
Thank you, Dave. So it's my great honor to introduce Senator Murkowski to give us some remarks. Everybody in this room knows that Alaska is on the front lines of an awful lot of changes that we're seeing across the ocean, across the globe. No state feels that more than Alaska. No person on Capitol Hill cares about those changes more than Senator Murkowski. Interestingly, Senator Murkowski is the first Alaskan-born senator to serve in the U.S. Senate, which is one milestone. The other milestone, of course, of the senators is that she is serving by virtue of a historic write-in victory in her last election, 2010, after entering the Senate in 2004. Senator Murkowski serves as chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, but also serves as chair of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Interior and Environment. So she's so she stands at the crux of a lot of these issues as they debate them in the committee structure in the Senate. But Senator Murkowski, that's not enough for her. She also takes these issues outside of the formal committee structure. She co-chairs the Oceans Caucus with Senator Whitehouse, who was here earlier, and she is co-chairing a new caucus to focus on the Arctic Caucus, with Senator King from Maine. And so very much on the front lines up in the field and in her home state, and on the front lines of the debates here in Capitol Hill, Senator Murkowski.
Well, thank you, and I have to begin my comments with an apology to our esteemed panel, Admiral Papp, Ambassador Balton, Lawson. Thank you, all of you. There is nothing worse than having somebody come in and interrupt a panel. Just as you get going with the flow of the flow, here comes the tardy partner. But not by design. I've got a schedule this morning that looks pretty darn good, and then you throw in votes and things that unfortunately take precedent over what you are doing assembled here. I apologize for that. So thank you for allowing me to interrupt for just a few moments before you go back to the comments from the panel. But I did want to provide my welcome, my thanks. I've participated in Capitol Hill Ocean Week in the past, and I thank you for what you are doing to shine the spotlight on really the lifeblood of our planet, and that is the health of our oceans and all that comes with it. I wanted to make just a few remarks today, and I appreciate the introduction about my passion for the Arctic, my passion for the place that I call home, an amazing place, but a place that has 33,000 miles of coastline. So we are very focused on our oceans. We are very focused on the health of our oceans, and we're very concerned as we see clearly the changes that are underway. We're very mindful that the Bering Strait is the only oceanic gateway between the Pacific and the Arctic Oceans. And you don't need to go up there to appreciate the proximity. I know it's a little bit tired right now, but you truly can see Russia from Alaska. It's 2.5 miles separating Big Diomede and Little Diomede. And when you are out on Big Diomede, you understand. And further to that, you recognize that on either side of these two islands is a very narrow passage on either side that is this choke point, if you will, between the Pacific and the Arctic. But it's not just a corridor for the maritime traffic, and clearly we're seeing the number of transits increase dramatically, but it's also for other traffic, for northward bound invasive species and heat that melts the sea ice, that raises the potential impact on ocean acidification. So it's one thing to talk about the maritime traffic, it's the other thing to talk about other traffic that comes through. We're also very mindful that within the Arctic, new observations of ocean currents show an unanticipated potential for pollutants in Russian waters to reach Alaska's shores. We talk a lot about the contingencies, the what-ifs, if there is development offshore Russia that results in calamity or catastrophe, and are we prepared for a potential Russian oil spill? And preparing for all of this requires investments. I think that people assume that in the Arctic we have more infrastructure and assets than we actually do. Quite frankly, we're starting from ground zero in many places, so we need to start with the building blocks of safe maritime activity. And some of it is basic infrastructure, whether it's charting, adequate charting, understanding where we are with the charting and knowing that we are so woefully behind. Aids to navigation. One would assume that those nav aids are in place, and in fairness, in many parts, too many parts, they are not. Search and rescue capabilities, we're clearly working to build those, but we need to be doing more and doing so aggressively. Deep water ports, we've just gotten the go-ahead. Nome will host that first deep water port on the U.S. side, and that's important. But what we're told is that's a 10-year project. 10-year project to get that deep water port advancing. And then there is the perennial discussion about ice-breaking capacity and where we are. Theoretically, we've got 2. I say we've got 1.5. We have the heavy strength icebreaker, the Polar Star. But in fairness, the Polar Star is on assignment to the Antarctica for the next 5 years. She has a useful life expectancy of 6 to 8 years. Do the math. We don't have that ice-breaking capacity that we need. The good news is that there's clearly support, growing support within the Congress to move out. Senator Cantwell and I are co-sponsors on a bill that would allow for the construction of 6 icebreakers, as has been recommended in the study. They would be designed and operated by the Coast Guard. We're actually in the midst of the NDAA authorization right now, and I'm told that we're theoretically going to be seeing an amendment that could help us with our icebreaker. Problem is it busts the budget. We don't have the money for it, so we're going to have some interesting discussion. But the fact that we're talking about an icebreaker at all is earth-shattering. It's fabulous. It is ice-shattering, whatever it is, but we're getting the attention of the nation. We have moved beyond an icebreaker being an Alaskan earmark to being understood that it must be a national asset, a national priority, and I think that is vastly important. We need to be figuring out ways that we combine the 8 Arctic nations' scientific capabilities. We have so much opportunity up there. We don't need to reinvent everything on our own. We have great capacity, great capability. Many research needs and questions cross our political borders, or they're in more international spaces. In the North Atlantic and the Pacific, the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, the ICES and the PICES, are examples of successful institutional arrangements for marine research. And I think there have been efforts to encompass the Arctic into either the ICES or the PICES or both, but perhaps what we need here is a separate Arctic ICES, more appropriate given the uniqueness of the region and the vast geographic areas the other 2 entities already cover. But in addition to what we're doing within international research, we must make sure that we are involving our local communities. The eyes and ears on the ground, get our young people involved, get our communities engaged in this. Let's make this happen. I have a proposal before the Energy Committee that would allow for revenue sharing, but a portion of this revenue sharing is directed to marine science through the North Slope Science Initiative. This is something that has been in place for some time. But as with all good ideas, if you don't have the resources behind them, it's only a good idea with no resources behind them. So how we can help to facilitate, how we can bring Western scientists and traditional knowledge together, I think is really the key for true stewardship. So managing our oceans with a stewardship that really is inherent in those who rely upon its bounty, but caring for the environment, it's not inconsistent with our other goals of producing jobs in the region and addressing our energy security needs. I know that you have good discussion in front of you. I know that you were in the midst of it before I intervened, but I would like to, again, following my apologies, thank each of you for your leadership in these areas. We have come a long way. And Admiral Papp, you have helped lead it when you were Commandant of the Coast Guard, but we have come a long way in making sure that not only the eyes of the nation, but the eyes of the world are on our U.S. Arctic. And I appreciate the opportunity to work with you in so many ways. And to those of you who are gathered here today, know that you're listening to a fine group of distinguished Americans on this issue. So thank you for letting me intervene. I'm going to go see what the rest of the chaos has ensued in the mere 20 minutes that I have been gone from that building on the hill. So thank you.
So Just a quick formal thank you, Senator, for making the trip. We do know how crazy it is, the fact that you were able to break away for a few minutes. Even as close as it is, the trip can seem awfully far and distant. So thank you for the time. Thank you for the work you do on the Hill. And we'll see you next year at CHOW again. Thank you.
So maybe we can return to some ice-shattering discussions of our own now. Lisa, the opening of the Arctic Ocean has presented some opportunities for economic development, certainly. We've heard about shipping, potential hydrocarbon development, tourism, even possible fishing in areas that have not been previously fished. Of course, each of these economic activities carries with them certain risks, and particularly risks to the environment. In your view, what is the appropriate role of the Arctic Council in sort of charting a path that balances the opportunities and the risks?
Thank you, Dave, and thank you so much for slotting me after a poised and wonderful speech by a senator, U.S. senator. I come at the Arctic from the perspective of someone who's worked on ocean conservation issues for several decades, and we've seen the kinds of results that the mistakes that we've made in the past have had, and I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion of those over the next few days. We have, our ocean is in serious trouble in many respects, overfishing, pollution, acidification, global warming, dead zones, the list goes on and on. In the Arctic, we have, in my view, a real opportunity to get oceans management right. And that's really the key here. And from our perspective, there are a number of things to think about before we go rushing in with a whole new slew of development. This is an area that is already under severe stress due to the loss of sea ice. Much of the Arctic marine life, as I'm sure most of you know, is exquisitely timed to the annual ebb and flow of ice. And the loss of that ice is having tremendous effects on the marine animals that live there and the communities in the Arctic that depend on that marine life. On top of this, we're now seeing development looking to fill the space left by the retreat of the sea ice. And that development includes oil development, it includes potential fisheries, and actual fisheries, particularly on the Atlantic side, shipping, and a whole range of other activities that may emerge over time. So when we think about controlling development and addressing it, I think we have a small window of opportunity to get out in front of all of that development and plan for it in an integrated fashion, the way that scientists tell us we need to do a much better job in the rest of our oceans. So here we have an opportunity in a new ocean to set some new paths forward for integrated management. And Admiral Papp referred to a regional seas approach. A regional seas approach has been used in many parts of the world to help coordinate and integrate the management of multiple human activities that can have effects on the same ecosystems. Senator Murkowski mentioned the likelihood or the possibility of pollutants that are released in Russia coming to our shores. The same goes for us to Canada and beyond throughout the Arctic. We really have to manage this in a cooperative, collaborative way if we're going to be successful in maintaining the resilience and the productivity and the functions of Arctic ecosystems and the communities up there that are reliant on those ecosystems. So I think it's important balance is important here, but we have a very special place, and we have only a limited amount of time to get into place some of the measures needed to make sure that we develop in a way that respects and protects the key systems and communities of this very sensitive region.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Lawson, you wanted to make a comment on something Senator Murkowski had alluded to.
Senator Murkowski mentioned the loaded term infrastructure. in the Arctic Council, we did this Arctic marine shipping assessment. We found out, not surprisingly, there's no infrastructure in the Arctic Ocean except for coast to Iceland, northern coast to Norway, northwest Russia. When you think of the United States Arctic, Canadian Arctic, Greenland, I mean, there is no zero world-class maritime infrastructure. So we can have all the agreements we want, but if you don't have the capacity to respond to spills or carry out search and rescue without adequate infrastructure, and of course the question came up even in the Arctic Council, who pays for this? Likely has to be public-private partnership with the maritime industry and the coastal states. It just can't all be borne by the taxpayers of the coastal states.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn to some questions we've already received from the audience. These are questions that have come in from you here with us in person, but I encourage all of you, including those online, to submit questions as well. We have quite a few here, but at least two of them relate to the same topic, and I thought perhaps I could combine them into one. They have to do with the potential for commercial fisheries opening up in the Arctic and what the nations in question are doing to address that potential, either through or outside of the Arctic Council. I'm wondering if anyone on our panel wishes to address that, or they prefer I do.
I think you are the best person to do that, Dave.
Admiral?
Yeah, I mean, we have the recognized expert with us here. He's been working on all these issues, who I normally turn to anyway.
That's why he picked this question.
So, in the United States exclusive economic zone north of Alaska, a decision was taken about 5 years ago to postpone the advent of commercial fishing until we had enough scientific information to manage fisheries properly in that area. And ever since then, we have been trying to get that same concept agreed to for the very large area of the Arctic Ocean that is beyond the fisheries jurisdiction of any of the coastal states, the so-called high seas pocket of the central Arctic Ocean. The United States has been working with 4 other countries whose EEZs border this area: Russia, Canada, Norway, and Denmark, in relation to Greenland. And we have a declaration that we are hoping to be able to sign this month. Yesterday, Secretary Kerry approved the U.S. signing of this declaration, and it would do just what I said. It would at least commit those governments not to authorize their own vessels to fish in this area until there is enough science and until there is some kind of international mechanism for managing the fisheries there. But of course, the way international law works, vessels from any other nation could, in theory, fish in this area, some of which is ice-free for at least part of the year at this point. And so the declaration among those 5 seems to me needs to be followed up by a broader mechanism that would bring to the table the other large distant water fishing nations that might have an interest in this. So watch this space. This is an interesting issue. I will say it is unfolding outside the Arctic Council rather than inside the Arctic Council for a variety of reasons, although the Arctic Council does do work that relates, at least in some tangential way, to the topic of fisheries in the Arctic.
So, Dave, can I ask a further question? So this approach it's very precautionary, and it's very smart, going out ahead of industrial development and saying, let's not do this until we understand what's out there and have enough information to set rational, science-based catch limits. Do you think that a similar approach might be applied to shipping, where the Arctic 5 or beyond come together and try to make some recommendations on how shipping or perhaps other activities might be controlled, or together you could go to the IMO and propose some certain steps could be taken to address in a similarly precautionary way the impacts of shipping?
So I'm going to see if my friend Lawson cares to answer that particular question.
Well, I think the IMO will take up fishing vessels and their operations in the polar regions, but they're careful to not take the place of the domestic and coastal states in this arena. A lot of these vessels are very small. They don't sail very far from their countries, although there are global fisheries, as we know, and some might come to the Arctic in the future. Bringing in the fishing vessels into the Polar Code, into IMO, is a very tricky and complex issue.
I think Lisa was talking about all vessels, right? And
Yes.
Yeah, and all vessels, there won't be any agreements among either 5 or 8 Arctic states, because all
Right.
8 Arctic states are global shipping nations, maritime countries. So there's likely not to be any agreement among themselves, because it's a global enterprise. So it's vast, one of the largest industries in the world, including all the cruise ships. And I think it needs to be tackled at IMO. The Polar Code began in 1993, and it'll be executed and in force in 2017, quarter of a century, 24 years. You might think maybe the Polar Code began in a precautionary way, even though there was shipping in the Arctic, but it took a quarter of a century to get this through the bureaucratic organization run by, under the UN. So I think long-term prospects for lots of elements and amendments to the conventions already existing in the Polar Code, but it's a long-term affair.
Admiral, you want to add something on that?
I did. And in Lisa's opening response there, she talked about a small window of opportunity. I think the window's gone. And I would ask the question, how many of you from the Washington, D.C. area? Could I see a raise your hands? All right, so some of you are going to understand what I'm talking about here. I'm a resident of Fairfax County. I've lived there off and on for 25 years, bought my home there 25 years ago in a small neighborhood that was supposed to be 800 homes, surrounded by mom and pop farms out there. 25 years later, there's over 2,000 homes in the community. The mom and pop farms are gone. We've never caught up in terms of roads and infrastructure. We've never caught up in terms of schools. The school that was built had trailers behind it before it was even 5 years old because it couldn't accommodate the number of students. I use that as an analogy of what's happening in the Arctic. Entrepreneurs do not wait for policy and for governments to act. Governments are bureaucratic. Bureaucracies, naturally and rightly so in most circumstances, are slow to react and slow to provide resources because you have to make some reasoned decisions. But entrepreneurs, in the absence of any other restrictions on them, are going to get out there and they're going to start conducting business. That's why we've seen shipping increase. That's why we're going to have a cruise ship with, between passengers and crew, about 2,000 people that are going to go next summer through the Arctic and through the Northwest Passage. They're selling tickets for it now. And are we prepared for that? Are we prepared for the increase in traffic through the Bering Strait? Do we have a harbor of refuge that oil spill response companies can operate out of forward deployed? Do we have air stations that can provide search and rescue? And the answers are all no, because we're still thinking about it and coming up with policies and procedures and other things. So I don't apologize. I was in the business of consequence management for about 40 years. So I do think that way. But I can think strategically as well, and that's why I enjoy being in the job I'm in. But what I'm saying is you've got to do both at once. You've got to start dealing with the consequences and preparing for them, while at the same time coming up with these overall policies. Unless you're going to come up with a policy that says no activity in the Arctic, period. And no one's going to buy that. Because you're constantly going to have the entrepreneurs that are going to be lobbying for increased activity, and then the environmentalists and others on the other side, they're going to saying, no, shut it down. Well, it's going to, something in the middle is going to be there, and we need to be prepared for that middle ground.
Well, Admiral, you opened up to a good question to follow up that very point from an online viewer. Any chance we will have sufficient cleanup infrastructure before the first oil spill in the Arctic? Well, there have already been some smaller oil spills. I think what the question's really getting at, before a large-scale oil spill.
Well, I've had a chance to look at Shell's preparations, for instance. I had a chance to look at it 4 years ago, before their first effort, and I went recently because I'm still interested to see what they're doing. And the Department of Interior is putting them through a very rigorous program to make sure they have resources in place to deal with any spill. But some of you might recognize the name Selandang IU, which was a ship that lost power, a modern ship that lost power and ran aground in the Aleutian Islands, the island of Unalaska. The 67,000 tons of soybeans that it contained didn't do a lot of damage when the ship broke up and it spilled, but the 1,000 tons of fuel that spilled out of his tank certainly did. So the potential for a fuel spill from a ship running aground in the Bering Strait is probably more likely than Shell drilling for oil and causing a spill right now. But whether it's drilling or whether it's a ship running aground and spilling its oil tanks, we don't really even know how oil reacts in the Arctic Ocean. We don't know if our cleanup techniques are adequate for that, because you can't spill any oil on purpose and then see how it cleans up or burns in situ, or whether dispersants work in Arctic waters. We need to be about the business, like I said, of exercising and experimenting and making sure that we've got the right equipment and response capabilities.
Thank you, Admiral. I'd like to change gears a little bit. Senator Murkowski referred to the problem of ocean acidification in the Arctic. Admiral Papp mentioned that's one of the areas in which the U.S. is also leading an initiative in the Arctic Council. Lisa, I'd like to ask you a question that to sort of rephrase it from the audience. How much do we know about ocean acidification in the Arctic, and what can the Arctic Council be doing to help advance human knowledge of the problem?
That's a great question. So in part because CO2 dissolves more readily in cold water. That's why your Coke has more bubbles in it when it's cold than when it's warm. You have a much greater opportunity for acidification to happen in polar waters. And we're already seeing that happen throughout the Arctic. One of the working groups of the Arctic Council, AMAP, has done a very comprehensive look at ocean acidification within Arctic waters and found that it's happening unevenly throughout the Arctic, but it's likely to continue to occur. And the problem with acidification, of course, is that anything with a skeleton or a shell, from deep sea corals to mussels and clams to the tiny pteropods at the base of the food chain, are very vulnerable to ocean acidification. There are two things that we really could be doing, I think, through the Arctic Council. The first is a vulnerability analysis. Where is ocean acidification happening to the fastest degree? Where are the communities that rely on shellfish, for example, for food, sustenance, subsistence, etc.? How do those overlap? And where should we focus our monitoring capability? If you do that kind of vulnerability analysis, it helps in a number of different ways. It helps inform communities that, in fact, they're facing a significant issue. It helps identify where you should put ocean acidification monitors to make sure that you have early warning for what's coming. And perhaps most importantly, from a conservation standpoint, it gives you another data point for helping plan where to site industrial activities that can have further stressing impacts on already stressed ecosystems that are being affected by ocean acidification. So I think there's a lot to be done here, and we at NRDC are working closely with NOAA and with state to try to advance a robust program of ocean acidification through the Arctic Council.
We have gotten a number of questions from you on various aspects of the same topic, namely the prospect for offshore oil and gas development in the U.S. Arctic. And I'm going to throw this open to any of the members of our panel. There are a few different aspects to the question. One version goes like this: the U.S. seems to be moving full speed ahead on oil gas drilling in the Arctic. Lisa, what roles do NGOs like yours play in supporting or slowing that process? Then related to that, interesting question, how can we make sure that those who benefit from resource extraction in the Arctic will help fund the new science monitoring these activities will require? I think Senator Murkowski alluded to something there. And then another question, different aspect of the same topic. Would the U.S. have a stronger hand in negotiating for conservation regimes if we had a different oil and gas development policy than we do? So I throw that open to any of you who might have a view on any part of that.
Well, there are already agreements with Shell, Statoil, and ConocoPhillips with NOAA to transfer data that that they would have on the environment and share it to the world. So I think there are some interesting public-private arrangements that can be had to share the wealth of knowledge that, in fact, offshore drilling will bring to the table.
Lisa.
So from our perspective, the Arctic is the very last place where we should be drilling. And if the administration wants to reach its climate goals, that oil ought to stay in the ground. We are not prepared. There are no roads. There are no airports in many parts of the Arctic. The closest Coast Guard station is close to, 1,000 miles away. We are not ready. We're not ready in Russia, and we're not ready in the United States for a major oil spill. Our view is that this should not happen in the Arctic. However, it is happening. It's happening already in Norway. It's happening in Russia. It's happening throughout the Arctic Ocean. And we need to take other steps to help identify and protect key ecosystems from not just oil drilling, but also from other damaging human activities. So part of the US agenda, I think that is very important, is this concept of establishing an ecologically connected network of MPAs throughout the Arctic, so that you have ecosystems that are important in one country for one species and in another country for the same species at a different stage of its life, protected in a way that will allow them to thrive. The other, I think, key piece of this is this concept of integrating the management of oil and gas with the management of shipping and fishing, so that we understand and take account for the effects of all of those things, together with ocean acidification and the loss of ice and warming of the Arctic Ocean, all of which are having huge effects already in a very vulnerable place.
Admiral?
Well, I think this all plays into exactly, this is where I started off with my comments this afternoon, is talking about a balanced program. Lisa certainly comes at it from one point of view, but she also talks about balance as we go forward. And you've got to get all parties to the table talking about this. I spoke to a group, Lisa was moderating, and I was on the panel about 2 weeks ago. It was right after the Shell decision by the Department of the Interior. And even though that's not a go-ahead to start drilling, it's another step in the process. But there was a gentleman, one of the first ones who got up with a question. He looked at me, he pointed at me, he says, "I am so disappointed with your president." And I said, "Well, I thought he's our president." He said, "I'm so disappointed with your president because he's opening up the Arctic to everybody." I went to Alaska last week, and while I'm up in Alaska, they're saying, "We're so disappointed with your president because he's closing down the Arctic to everybody." So, I mean, you can't win. But what you can do is you can bring both views and try to bring them closer to the middle. If economic development, if resource exploitation is going to take place, then we need to make sure all the proper policies, safety procedures, everything that Lisa's talking about is in place. Otherwise, you either shut it down or you open it up completely, but none of us want that. What we want is sustainable, reasonable, environmentally sound development to occur, because the Alaskans have a vote in this as well. They want economic prosperity too. So, therein lies the challenge. It's not an easy issue, and it doesn't lend itself to simple solutions. It's very complicated, but we need to be about the business moving this forward, and we're hopeful that our Arctic Council chairmanship program will help to do that.
Lawson, you
Yeah,
want to add something?
just to add, these issues are circumpolar. It seemed a little biased in the question that it was just the United States. Excuse me. 2 Arctic states, their Arctic natural resources are critical to their GNP. Very clear that Norway and Russia are going to proceed through the century and beyond to develop these resources to sustain their national economies. Now, for Canada and the United States, the percentage of input of Arctic natural resources is much, much smaller, but nonetheless important to our economy. So I think it shouldn't be just viewed in the lens of offshore development in the United States, when 2 major Arctic states, Norway and Russia, are in fact perhaps ahead of us, and not necessarily in terms of TAPS or the drilling we did in the 60s. But in offshore, they've been doing it long before and are proceeding with a great investment.
Thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of our hour. I don't know that we have time for another question. So we have 4 more minutes, so maybe one quick question then. Let's take this one. Admiral Papp, you spoke of the possibility to develop an Arctic Regional Seas program. Could you elaborate on that? Under whose auspices would this occur, and would it be on the basis of a binding agreement?
I think Senator Murkowski made a great point that plays into why I see the need, why we, the United States, sees a need for a regional seas program. She talks about not everybody recreating the wheel. Now, I admit this would be difficult right now, and yes, U.S. needs icebreakers, but you know, if you look at the 8 Arctic countries, there's a lot of icebreakers between them right now. In fact, we probably have, maybe, I'm not going to say, I hate to put this out on record because it might hurt some other things we're doing, but there's probably enough icebreaker capacity between the 8 countries to do the types of things we want to do and share mission support and other things. If only we could work together more closely and come up with some sort of cooperative agreement. Search and rescue. Does every country need to build 100 helicopters, create air stations? Maybe not. Do we need to create 8 command centers to have maritime domain awareness? No. No one country can afford to invest in all those things. But cooperatively, we might work together better to come up with solutions to these problems. And I think that therein lies the beauty. We all have a certain level of resources, expertise. The United States is probably more heavily invested in satellites, providing navigation resources. Maybe somebody else can invest in icebreakers, and then we share these. These are all things that I think have potential out there and would play into it.
Thank you very much. I am going to try to draw this to a close, so I wanted to offer a few thoughts of my own as we wrap up. The U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council is, as I said at the beginning, just begun. Indeed, the first meeting of the senior Arctic officials under the chairmanship of the U.S. takes place next week right here in Washington. And for those of you who are interested in following this, and I encourage you all to do so, it's an exciting time. There will be 20 to 25 meetings over the course of the next 2 years, many of them in the United States, many, but not all, in Alaska, covering the topics that we spoke of today and a dozen or more additional topics. There are 6 standing working groups of the Arctic Council. There will be, for each of the meetings of those working groups, possible side events and other ways that people can sort of plug into the process. And we are looking for your interest and support. It's an exciting time for us, and we are trying also to use the chairmanship to build awareness of the changing Arctic here at home. Compared to the other 7 members of the Arctic Council, a typical American spends less time thinking of ourselves, the United States, as an Arctic nation, and yet we are. We have the opportunity over the course of the next 2 years to help educate our fellow citizens of the United States about the importance of these issues, about the enduring interests our nation has in the Arctic region, about the changing Arctic Ocean and the challenges facing the ocean itself. And with your help, I think we can make a change in the way people think about all this. And I'm on a roll, but I'm offering the floor to Lisa Spear.
So I just want to do a quick shout out to Dave and Admiral Papp and Secretary Kerry for the visionary agenda that they have laid out for this 2-year period. It is a very challenging period. There are huge opportunities. I don't think the window is closed. I think we can make real progress in the next 2 years, and we need as many people involved in this as we can get. So I encourage everyone in this room who's even remotely interested in the Arctic to get involved in the next 2 years and help us make this a real game changer for the Arctic.
And with that, I think it's left to me to thank all of you for your participation in the room and online. I thank my distinguished colleagues on the panel, and particularly thanks to Jason Patlas and the Capitol Hill Ocean Week gang for inviting us here.
Well, thank you, David. The mark of a great moderator is to concede the last word to one of his panelists. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, David. And we'll see you all tomorrow. Registration opens at 9 a.m. First panel is up at 9:30. Have a good afternoon.